Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe. Welcome to City Talk. Hope you had a nice long weekend, a bit of a break, a bit of a respite, some virtual Zoom time with family members, and an opportunity to take a bit of a pause and reflect a bit. And now we're back Monday morning in Calgary, Monday midday on the Eastern time zone, and very pleased to have folks joining us today to talk about something really important. What's the recovery of local economies going to look like? What are they currently challenged by? So CUIs in the connective tissue business, these are what these sessions are about, is helping us try to make some sense out of what's going on. We're trying to focus specifically on what people are seeing now, what they're experiencing in particular sectors, particular aspects of urban life, and to really share information across the country. In this case, we have someone from the US joining us as well, to inform how we're coping, ways in which we're responding, and then what are the implications for the short, medium, and longer term. We put up some sites, CityShareCanada.ca, CityWatchCanada.ca, and this is now City Talk, to try to help us decipher this and try to figure this out with lots and lots of partners and volunteers from across the country. If you have bandwidth and you have some time in your day to help us populate those sites, please email us at covidresponse@canurb.org, and we'd be happy to have 30 minutes of your time each day to help us continue to populate these learning platforms. I'm in Toronto. We have people participating from other places, but I'm just going to acknowledge in terms of where this broadcast is originating from. It's in the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many, many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. Toronto was also covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are very cognizant that each of us speaks from a place. CUI really is about place and how we strengthen place. And we have long, long histories and traditions of place that we're trying to reconcile as we go through this extraordinarily challenging time. So it's an all hands on deck moment, and I want to just at the outset recognize that we are very aware that there are thousands and thousands of people across Canada and the United States and around the world who are engaged in first response, and they are in emergency mode. They are trying to save lives, and we are very aware that that is not what this conversation is about, but we want to be supportive and aware that many, many folks are engaged in that. And this is a kind of parallel activity to just help those of us observing to try to learn as much as we possibly can in terms of what is next for urban life. So the conversations are practical, they're focusing on specifics, and as I suggest, they're going to be on the immediate term, maybe medium 2 or 3 months out to the end of the summer, and then longer term. And we're really focusing on what's working, what's not, and what's next, and particularly what are we seeing. This conversation happens here. It also happens on a chat box. And so we'd encourage all participants to feel free to chat away. These have been very rich places for the discourse in the last several that we've done of these. And we would encourage you to send your comments, not just to all panelists, send it to everyone so that everyone can see them. I'm monitoring the chat box. I have colleagues monitoring as well. And we'll feed your comments and questions into the group on the stage here on the screen so that they're informed as well. But please feel free to have a go. And also a little disclaimer here, unlike Las Vegas, as I said, what goes on the chat box stays on the chat box. So think before you push send, because it's on there for perpetuity. You can't take it down. We learned this. And we are archiving all the chats, and we are also keeping the videos and the audios of these things. And we've already posted some from last week up at canurb.com/City Talk. You can see them all there. And we think that there's a rich discourse that we want to continue to harvest, as I suggested. So this is the first step, and I really appreciate my colleagues coming in this morning and at midday to talk with us. Everyone here is participating as an individual. They may work for a public entity, they may have clients that are public entities or private entities, but just to be clear, we're all here talking as individuals and muddling through as best we can in terms of trying to make sense of what's going on. We're recording this, as you can see. We would encourage you to use Twitter if you'd like, #CityTalk, and I'm going to start. So joining us from not quite coast to coast, coast to mid country. We have Bruce Katz. Again, we're not putting up detailed bios. You can look on the chat and you can Google. Everybody here, you can Google and get lots. Bruce Katz, who I think are you in Washington today, Bruce?
Absolutely. Bruce
in Washington. Patrick Sullivan, who's in Halifax with that fabulous Zoom background that somebody has made for you. Very impressive. Mark Garner, who's with the Downtown Yonge BIA in Toronto. Mary Moran, who's the president and CEO of the Calgary Economic Development Corp. Hey, Mary, nice to see you. Glad you're having your morning coffee with us. And Karen Wong, who has been way ahead of this curve in terms of making the transition to digital, and is going to talk to us about what are the digital opportunities for economies, so local businesses and economies. So I'm going to start with you, Bruce, as our invited American. You know, I've had some questions as we've been starting here about what is a local economy. So I think many of us in the city building business have been arguing for a long time that economies are fundamentally urban things. 65% of the Canadian GDP comes out of 5 metro areas. But why don't you start us off in terms of your understanding of the local economy and what you're really observing and where you think you need to go, where metropolitan regions need to go to keep these local economies vibrant. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Mary, and welcome to everyone. Obviously, cities and metropolitan areas and their economies are the organizing unit of the global economy, and they're complex organisms. So when you think about the impact of this economic shutdown on cities and metros, you've got to look at different facets, different sectors, different clusters, anchor institutions, eds and meds, professional services, other services, manufacturing, innovation, logistics, and so forth. There has been an intense focus in the United States on the impact of small business, and particularly small businesses in the hospitality sectors. So think Main Street businesses, downtowns, commercial corridors, main streets in smaller suburban jurisdictions. They are shut down in many parts of the US. Many of them have cash reserves of 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. So there has been an intense focus at the local level first. This is what's so critical, to stand up relief funds, whether it's city governments, public authorities, philanthropies, business chambers, or financial institutions. But the cities and the municipal jurisdictions and some states have been first fingers in the dike, trying to get flexible resources to these at-risk businesses, particularly micro businesses, particularly Black-owned or brown-owned businesses in the US that are most at risk. The federal government has then come in with very large programs. In our Small Business Administration, some coming out of disaster relief, some a new paycheck protection program, some even coming out of our Federal Reserve Bank, a Main Street lending facility. These tend to work very well for companies that have existing banking relationships that are already in the mainstream of the system. So as we go forward, what we're finding in the US is that these local relief funds, which were set up initially, particularly in Seattle, San Francisco, New York City, and have now moved across the country, they're playing a critical role with this stratified and segmented small business market, really 0 to 20 employees that are not really in the mainstream financial system. And if we don't act with alacrity, if we don't act at scale, and if we don't act with appropriate capital, we're going to lose them. And then we're going to wake up, you know, when we come out of our basements bleary-eyed, whenever that is, and we're going to go into our downtowns and commercial corridors and literally find like empty movie sets or stage sets. Buildings will be intact, but these small businesses will have not just shuttered, they will have collapsed. So there is a sense of real urgency here. The federal government is responding, but it's responding slow and not particularly in a way that ultimately aligns with the needs of these particularly small businesses and Black and brown-owned businesses.
Thanks, Bruce. We're going to come back to this notion of local sources of relief funds because, as Paul McKinnon is quite rightly pointing out on the chat, Canadian municipal governments are restricted from doing this. So welcome to the Canadian Constitution, odd as it is, but we're going to come back to that. So Mary, I'm going to go to you next in Calgary. What are you seeing? What are you observing?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to level set, I think Calgary's in a really unique situation because we've been through 5 years of a structural change in the energy industry, and our problems are really complex, right? So we currently have 25% office space vacancy, which is about 14 million square feet of empty office space that we've had for, you know, the better part of that 5-year downturn, and but by far have the highest amount of office space on a per capita basis than any other jurisdiction in North America. We have double the amount of Toronto, you know, 4 times the amount of Detroit, or you know, 3 times the amount of Houston, et cetera, Pittsburgh, all who have made great economic returns at a different time. We also have this. We also have a very young, highly educated population that's staying in Calgary. Unlike other cyclical downturns in the energy industry, they're actually staying, so a greater sense of attachment for sure. And I would just say that, you know, we've been working really hard to try to change perceptions about Calgary over the last 5 years. We've been trying to talk to people about what else is going, that we have a burgeoning kind of a tech sector. We're really working to embrace digital technologies to advance the industrial Internet of Things across all of our sectors. And 2020 was supposed to be our defining year of making a bit of a pivot on that regard. And of course, then we get hit with COVID. Then we get hit with another global oil price war. So it's like a triple effect in Calgary. And I can tell you, it's a community that's devastated. We're talking about unemployment as high as 25%. GDP is obviously going to contract probably greater than other parts of the city. And although everybody is being hit hard, I would just say Calgary is being hit harder. So, you know, we actually have had a local fund, a city fund, not for incentives per se, but that we would help build ecosystems to advance our strategy, Calgary and the new economy. And so that would work at ecosystems and anchors to help scaling companies grow. And we have been tempted this whole time to kind of jump into the COVID. How do you help small businesses respond? How do you use it as a bailout fund? How do you use it for COVID growth opportunities? And basically have just stepped back and just said, we're going to need this money as much when we're coming out of this as in rebuilding as we are going to need it today, right? And so we just have made the decision that are going through the process of making the decision that it can't be an emergency fund, because $100 million isn't going to save an economy that has such complex problems as we do. And so we have to ensure that we are very thoughtful. We're laser focused on the companies that we have invested in to make sure they get through this COVID, during COVID and post-COVID. And then we have to really think thoughtfully about how we use that fund to accelerate whatever the new norm is for Calgary, which doesn't feel normal at all.
Again, you're pointing out, you know, whose funds, at which point in the crisis, whose funds are the most appropriate, who can get them into the right folks. So I hear you saying you're holding yours. I'm just for the audience, for the gathered assembly on this session, I'm going around just at the first tier to get everybody to get their oar in, and then we'll start to unpack these things and it'll be a less formal conversation. So Patrick, I want to come to you next. Talk to us about Halifax. I know you also have empty office floors. I was in both Halifax and Calgary in the last several months, and so I know as Mary, I'm interested in the way you spun that. You've got more commercial space than anybody else. Fabulous, and you've got lots of empty. And I know Halifax does too. Patrick, let's hear from you.
Well, and you're absolutely right. Although, I mean, I must say we felt very good about Halifax's growth over the last number of years. I mean, we had 2.9%, 2.6% GDP growth in 2019. Our population has grown quite significantly, which is a bit unusual in Nova Scotia. Our population has not been increasing significantly. Halifax is up to 440,000 people, up 2.3% over the last number of years, with a goal of growing to 550,000. So we were in a great place. I'd like to think that we're still going to be in that great place as we come out of this. We've had a lot of construction in Halifax. We've had a lot more office space that has been developed, which has kind of left a number of smaller spaces behind. So yeah, we're almost at 20% vacancy rates in Halifax, but we think that there will be a turnover to, whether it's residential over time. as there has been significant building. But we're experiencing, much the same thing everyone else is. Halifax is a bit of a split personality. We're a bit of a tale of two cities. We have a significant government and academic presence in this city. So, greater than 25% of the working population are government employees. And thankfully, I think they're still getting paid. I'd like to think they're still spending money. But clearly the private sector is not. We've had a number of restaurant employees in HRM is about 22,000 people, and the number of employees laid off are 20,000. So 20 of the 22. In hotels, there's roughly 3,000 employees and 2,700 of them. So there's 300 employees left in hotels. So we've got a real devastation in the hospitality, in the tourism sectors, in restaurants. But just to address some of the points that some of the other folks have made, I mean, what we've seen from the federal government is the start of some of that cash coming in. We have yet to see the cash, primarily through the wage subsidy. People are getting money, and I think we've seen that with the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. So people are getting their $2,000. That's very helpful. Hopefully they'll be able to pay their rent. They'll be able to at least spend a little of that on their food needs and those sorts of things. We're now at the provincial level where the province has stepped up and is providing some programs, a $5,000 business impact grant. So not a loan, a grant to small businesses that were ordered closed, but only those that were ordered closed. And now we're at the municipal level. And to your point, municipalities can't go into debt. Certainly in Nova Scotia, I was unaware that it was across the country, so didn't know that. But they can't go into debt. So what can the municipality do to support these micro businesses, which even with that cascade of money from the feds and the province are still being left behind?
I don't think it's just that they can't go into debt. It's also that there are restrictions to whether they can give money to businesses. That's what I think some of the commenters are reacting to. But I'm going to come back to that. Thanks, Patrick. I'll go down to Mark Garner, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what he's experiencing in his role as leading a downtown business improvement area, right smack down in the main. He's the main spine of the Toronto downtown, the commercial corridor, Yonge Street. So, Mark, talk to us about what you're seeing.
No, I think it's, thanks, Mary. I think it's the same as what everybody else is experiencing. I mean, obviously, Yonge Street, Canada's iconic Main Street, shut down very quickly, starting early March. Just the economic impact of shutting down this Main Street, being the #1 tourist destination in Toronto. We have the preeminent retail location, Yonge Dundas Square. It is the busiest street in Canada. 238,000 people cross the intersection of Yonge and Dundas on an annual basis or on a daily basis. 42 million people walk north and south on Yonge Street. So when you think about that volume of pedestrian traffic now disappearing, the economics of that has been significant. So the street has closed. We're doing our best to make sure that it is a safe street. We're very concerned about those people that are still on street, the street engaged individuals that have been forced out of shelter services or other support services, to make sure that they're getting the supports they need. Obviously, the hospitality industry has been the hardest hit. We have about 26% of all the hotel stays in Toronto are in our patch. So that has been a significant loss. Obviously, with all the restaurants, those closing, being able to support just those restaurants that are still open and provide takeout has been a main focus for us. But the uniqueness of our neighborhood is we're not just a live, work, play, learn, and shop neighborhood. So the impact, when you think about the university now going online, when we've had 100,000 students in the area at any given point in time, and the economics they generate, we're in an interesting time in trying to calculate the impacts on our sectors and support them as best as possible.
Thanks, Mark. Karen, you were kind of ahead of the curve here. You were already trying to get digital stuff happening. Why don't you tell a little bit about what you've been doing, but then specifically, what are you seeing in the COVID time?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Mary. So we actually deal with about 6,000 merchants across North America right now, many of whom are small businesses, but a little bit more established. So when I say established, that means that they are using more legacy systems, installed point of sale systems, probably not online. And the reality is that most retailers actually still are not online if they are small businesses, right? So I hear everybody here obviously talking about it from a different perspective. The relief funds are certainly, everybody's grateful to have them if they are available and the cash is coming. That being said, though, they are obviously just a stopgap, right? If you're not selling, they're not going to help. And that ultimately is the big problem when it comes to digitization. And what we found to be the biggest challenges right now for our merchants is there's different phases of this crisis. I'm talking from a retail perspective, because that's the industry I deal with. Walmart's president recently announced we're now in the hair dyeing phase, right? People are now past the hoarding of toilet paper and they now need to color the white, right? So, I mean, there's different cycles and waves of this whole phase. And part of the problem is your business, where does that fit in that phase? That has been a huge problem because different sectors and different industries just don't fit into maybe the first two waves of retail hoarding or retail purchasing. And that has been a problem. I mean, if you're selling bridal gowns, for example, and there are no weddings, no matter what you do to your business to digitize, it's not going to happen. It's not going to help, right? So the relief would be very different in that sector versus grocery, or obviously we found a surprising uplift in toy stores because everybody's kids need to be occupied right now, right? So there's certainly key industries that are seeing the impact and not. But in terms of challenges, I would go back to the fact that people need to understand when you digitize, what does that mean? What are the short-term low-hanging fruit that you can do immediately? And then obviously, what do we change for the new normal? Because that new normal is not here right now, but we need to think about that because there's some major things that will possibly impact, and I know that so many people here are going to be involved in that, things like zoning, right? Some of you may have heard about what Lululemon has done with their stores recently. They've been able to convert all their stores into distribution centers because of the technology that they use. Now, if that's no longer a store, how does that impact the hiring, the people? Do they have open hours? Are they open if they're inside a mall or not? So there's so many different things involved in this that obviously require urban engagement, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, thanks, folks. You got us all onto some really interesting things. We're getting lots of action in the chat here about, you know, the longer term implications of what does this really mean for how businesses organize themselves? Should we have alternate forms of organization? Are co-ops more resilient, et cetera, et cetera? I want to get to that in a sec. What I really want to go back to is just immediate relief and how we've been doing that in Canadian cities. Bruce, our emphasis has been on a couple of things. One is getting money into the hands of Canadians through bank transfers, which is the emergency relief benefit. But then primarily, the business supports have been, with the, Patrick mentioned one, has been primarily to make it easier for businesses to assume debt. And that is, the sector's been pushing back saying that doesn't help. And what Karen just suggested, even if you give them a $40,000 loan, what are they going to do with the money? Because their staff are actually at home collecting employment insurance. So I'm just curious, does anybody want to pursue any of this around whether or not we've had adequate cash being infused? And do we need better mechanisms to get that? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, I'll start, I guess. I mean, the answer is no. The answer is no for a couple of reasons. For just the reason you alluded to. I mean, small businesses, and we're talking very small businesses, are deathly afraid of debt. You know, as Bruce said, I mean, if some of those folks have a couple of weeks of cash on hand, how will they ever pay back the money? There's simply no way. I mean, 83% of our 1,700 members are small businesses. Some of them are very small. And, you know, they're simply saying, we understand there's a loan available. We just can't take the loan. We're so deathly afraid of a loan. How would we ever pay it back? And my comment to them is, well, at least take the $40,000 Canadian Emergency Business Account. That way you can get $10,000 in forgiveness. And their answer is, well, we're not structured to do that because we don't have $50,000 in payroll. Right. Because we've been paying ourselves with dividends because we're so small, right, or just doing draws on the business. So anyway, that's my quick comment.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Are there other instruments? I mean, is there other advocacy that we should be undertaking to get the federal government to create some other kind of tools, and maybe in tandem with provincial governments? Anybody else struck on anything that we should be pursuing?
I just want to confirm this concern about debt. There's a level of uncertainty here, obviously. We're not sure when we're going to open up or what the nature of opening up will look like. What if we don't have a cure? What if we don't have a vaccine? We're going to have to, for people to come back to the main streets, whether they're in big cities or medium or small cities, there has to be a level of confidence that they're not going to be reinfected. And obviously, you watch the American news. You understand the struggle we have between the national government, our governors, our mayors, et cetera. There's no uniform trust or set of information that we can all rely on right now. I will say that the federal government, with its Paycheck Protection Program, which is a new program, initially sized at $350 billion, they are considering in Congress today whether to grow that to $600 billion. Is essentially a forgivable loan product to cover payroll and in the near term. You know, with regard to the micro businesses, it's really the local level that is giving direct cash infusion for the next 2 months, 3 months, so folks can survive as a bridge to get to some of these potentially larger federal resources.
And Bruce, the mechanism, when you say they're doing that, how are they getting money into the hands of businesses?
They're going through banks. So they're going through banks that have been certified lenders with the federal government, and they've opened that up. The challenge with that is many of our large banks went to their priority customers first. You know, the way we define small businesses in the US is less than 500 employees.
Yeah.
So the folks who got served first are mid-size enterprises that have long-standing bank relationships with either major national or regional banks. And it's the little guys who are really in a different kind of economy that aren't getting served by this.
I mean, I guess, do we want to differentiate between local economy, meaning, I mean, Mary, you've got a lot of mid-sized businesses in your bailiwick, not just street retail, right?
Yeah, we still, 70% of the business in Calgary would still be considered small to medium-sized businesses. So it's not all.
How are you defining small and medium?
With small being less than 50.
Less than 50, right? Right.
But, you know, I mean, I think we had a problem coming into this, which was we have a structural problem in our tax structure because we had this, you know, large downtown office, occupied office space, you know, with 42 million square feet per population of 1.4 or 1.3 million. The city was benefiting from, the entire city was benefiting from the taxes that were generated out of those office towers, right? Prior to 2014. And then of course, you know, we early on said that it's going to take us about 15 years to fill up that office space. So it quickly had an impact obviously there was it devalued, the office space assets devalued, and it had a direct impact of about $250 million on our city of Calgary tax base, right? And so, but we had the structural problem where it had to be pushed to the outside the downtown core businesses or smaller businesses, right? And that was painful over the last 4 years. And we also have another structural problem, which is we have low non-resident or not low residential taxes. So we have the people that were getting squeezed were the small businesses over the last 4 years. So we actually saw a lot of businesses close over the last 4 years in the first part of this challenging time that we have been experiencing, because it wasn't being pushed to residential, and it was being pushed from large office spaces to smaller businesses. So we had this big structural problem, which is just being compounded. So, you know, out of the gate, it was, you know, so obviously last week we had deferral of property taxes for businesses, which is helpful, but it's not the only solution for sure. But I kind of am with Patrick. It's, you know, you have to be careful not to create bailout funds, because we don't know what the world's going to look like post-COVID. And how are we going to have to help companies then, you know, the ones that survive to accelerate that survival, right? So I worry about that.
Yeah, one of the suggestions I'd heard was, you know, should we have had a situation where your HST for the last 6 months could have been rebated back to you? Because part of it is just the mechanics of getting money into people's hands. It's not the easiest thing to actually do. But as you suggest, on the other side, folks are saying, well, wait, there were some local street businesses that were already on their last legs. So is this just, hastening a kind of an inevitable thing? And that, to what extent do we want to be propping that up? Mark, what are you observing? I mean, Yonge Street is the tale of Yonge Street is a really interesting tale about urban life generally, right?
And how it's changed, and it
Right.
is getting to that point that both Mary and Karen have mentioned, is the phases we're going to go through. When we look at just high street retail in our neighborhood, 24 months ago, I didn't have flagship H&M, Muji, Uniqlo, Nordstrom's. That's one solution that we need to look at as, current needs versus what are midterm needs and long-term needs. Then I have also small independent business that have been getting access to cash now. Again, it's how do we prepare for the next phase? In the city of Toronto, we know that it's costing us $65 million a week to keep the city operational. And we know that there's a large expense of $739 million that have been allocated for the current run rate. But at our current spend rate, this would exhaust June 1st. So if we're not through this next phase, what are the solutions that are needed? I think, the long-term strategy and some of the things we'll need to look at, because everybody's assuming that there's a large pot of cash that we can all just go to and pull out of. We're at a time where we need to see war bonds come back, but it's going to be a COVID-19 bond. We need to find more, creative solutions to get money back into this country that are currently stored offshore. We need to look at, money that is leaving this country. How does that money stay in this country to be the economic stimulus that we need? Because we know we need to spend our way out of this. But what is the new norm? And we're already thinking about just shutting down festivals and events in our neighborhood for a summer. And I could just cite, the one festival that has a huge economic draw for us was Busker Fest. It used to be on Yonge Street. That has $42 million of direct and indirect spending in our neighborhood over 4 days. So if we can't convene the way we used to convene in the past, then what does the North by Northeast Festival, which is a key economic driver for not only the city of Toronto, but for our neighborhood specifically? So we're always talking about cash. We need more cash. We need to get access to cash. I think there is potential need to look at, just limiting taxation for numerous years, because also as part of a membership-based organization, I've got retail businesses that are not paying their rents currently, but the building owner has to still pay the banks and everybody else. So we're trying to find these solutions, and they're extremely complex. And we're trying our best, but I think going forward, some unique opportunities have to be discussed, some very hard decisions and discussions have to be had, and we have to find a way to stimulate this economy globally.
I mean, money's going to be scarce, and you want to say to city governments, and municipal governments, you need to have a holiday from property tax. But of course, as you say, their burn rate is some ridiculous amount every day now. So but they know that they're not going to be able to raise property tax. Mary, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think I just want to hit on that stage point, because I and also wanted to make the comment that HST is a foreign word to me. So it's not either we can pull in Alberta. So,
oh, right. Forgot that.
Into political kind of territory here, but I think part of our challenge is we had to kind of break down these phases, right? And we don't know the timing of these phases, but we're really in what we call respond or survival mode right now. So what are the tools you can provide? And I'll come back to that. But then you have to be in the rebuild mode, and that's where I think cities are going to have the greatest impact, right? So and then in our case, it's recovery. Probably the rest of the country, it will be growth, right? And so, the survival mode is, yes, we need deferral of property taxes, and we have to encourage a number of businesses to go online, and we have to encourage companies to go, we're creating a marketplace where people can go find where COVID opportunities are, so they can pivot. And then we have connecting YYC, which is where people can go find that there are actually jobs, right, in either COVID growth and or high growth industries. But when we get into the rebuild, for us anyway, it's going to be a lot of retraining of people, because we know there's going to be people that are permanently shed from industries. And our whole mission, and Karen, you'll love this, but we're really trying to teach everybody across all industries how to become, you know, because we have a disproportionate number of engineers in our city, but they don't know the digital technologies or the advanced technologies that are going to impact every single industry. So we're doing kind of energy to digital training right now, and we want to do that in like to thousands of people. So that retraining is going to happen in the rebuild, and then it's like just support your local business. Like, you know, we're the home of WestJet. We want to make sure everybody's flying WestJet when we return to business, right? Or, you know, so, you know, that's where, you know, we had to kind of break it down to those three stages: respond, rebuild, and then for us, recovery, which as they say, for the rest of the country would be growth. And you have to think about what your opportunities. You could blow your brains out in the respond, right? And it's easy to give people that need help money, because it's not easy to tell when you're handing out tax rebates and bailouts whether they were or were not a fragile business prior to COVID, right? And so
well, you can imagine in the chat function, we're getting lots of people saying, isn't this in fact justification for universal basic income? That in fact the CERB is becoming a cash transfer to individuals, so you put money in the hands of people so they can buy groceries and pay their rent, and that do we focus on that versus actually putting resources into the business? Okay, Karen, I know you're trying to jump in on all things digital. Go.
Well, thank you, Mary, for bringing that up. I didn't want to raise it myself. Seems like a conflict of interest for myself, right, when it comes to digitization. But I mentioned low-hanging fruit before, right? Because the cost of training and using these technologies is surprisingly low. The problem is the learning curve. And the fact that most retailers or most merchants and small business owners don't know how exactly to do what they do. I've seen somebody here already mention Digital Main Street, which is a fantastic organization and the things that they're doing. But I think the issue right now is exactly this. There's time, if assuming we have CERB and we have some of those short-term relief funds to actually change your business, this is the time to do it. You have the actual business is down, and you can actually do the things you need to do to make those small pivots and changes to actually make your business available online, be found online, and sell online, or even just take orders, right? Not just through a phone. And these are the types of things that we're not seeing support for, because these are still investments at the end of the day. And if people don't have enough money to pay rent, they're not going to be spending money to invest. And this is exactly kind of where I actually did submit a proposal to the provincial portal, the federal portal, but I understand there's certainly priorities, right? Obviously, healthcare frontline workers and certain sectors are prioritized over things such as urban rebuilding at this point, right? But that's certainly something we have to think about. Although, you know, it's a scary thought, because once you walk down this process, what happens to the need for in-person physical retail or stores? And where does it go from there, right? And we are enabling a future that requires less of what we are trying to save. So
I mean, this is the challenge we have at CUI. You know, we're interested, our commitment is to places, to the actual physical place, the spatial manifestation of a community in a city, and how the economy historically has thrived because of the adjacency and the proximity and all the interaction, and more Canadians are choosing to live in these environments. So I hear you, like if we go to a totally digitized and we lose that face-to-face piece, at what cost? You know, for us, what happens to streets, what happens to neighborhoods, what happens to vibrancy? So we're with you, Karen, and struggling with this. You want folks to be able to be competitive and be able to be contemporary in how they carry on, but at the same time, we don't want to become so atomized that none of us ever sees each other, right?
Yeah.
I think it is a bit of a challenge, just to chime in on this, is again, we're starting to look at, you know, the calculations of our neighborhood, and it's time to leverage your embryonic data, whatever you know. Data is going to be a part of a major guiding point on next steps and what we need to do. So understanding your neighborhoods and the economic stimulus that they can provide. Obviously, we're encouraging everybody that does have a cash flow right now to spend and support the businesses that are there. But again, we're expecting, you know, post-COVID, what does our vacancy rate turn into? Right now, we run at about a 8 to 15% vacancy rate on Yonge Street. But we could be calculating anywhere from 30 to 40% vacancy rate in a new world. So then how do you bring product back in to that urban environment, Mary? And how do we stimulate those people to get back out of their houses? You and I had talked in the past, even with businesses that are going to open again, those restaurants are not going to be able to hire back all their employees in one fell swoop. So it's going to have to be a phased labor implementation to bring people back, to get back to full-time employment.
Yeah, Patrick, you were trying to get in.
Yeah, I think, and just to build on that comment, I mean, the question is, will we ever get back with some of those restaurants? So, you know, I think of an area, we have Quimple Road, which launched an initiative today where they're trying to take all of the businesses in their business improvement district and bring them online. So they've launched an online component. You can now go there, you can now shop. It's wonderful. But so many of those restaurants are now finding that they can do takeout and delivery without the need for the size they used to have, because they simply don't need the chairs anymore. And what will happen, you know, when this ends, you know, I'm not silly enough to think that it'll end in May. I mean, I think we're thinking that we're going to be at home, as I suspect many areas are, until at least June and likely into July, you know, as this phased opening starts to begin at that point.
Yeah. Is anybody of this group, is anybody in touch with the insurance industry? Lori-Ann Gervin's asking us this on the chat. Are you, Patrick? What are you hearing from the insurers?
Well, they've been able to defer things. The whole concept of pandemic insurance is illusory and never existed. So no one is getting paid off on that. But they, to me, they sound like they're being very cooperative and working with many of the folks in the various industries.
So, you know, if you think of the broad things you're talking about, guys, you're talking about cash. How do we actually get cash in versus debt? This point that Mary just raised about having to retrain folks, you know, if digital is going to become more and more a part of the way we work, then are we going to have to, and I appreciate what people that have had, communities that have had dominant industries like Calgary has had, or like Detroit had, or how do you take a large workforce that have been trained to do one set of things? You've got so much tacit knowledge there. How do you repurpose those skills into a new way? And how do you, so investments in training. Mark, I'm in love with your idea of a war bond or a COVID bond or whatever that is. There's, you know, you can see in our own vicinities, people, consumers are wanting their local businesses and local economy to survive. They want to see this continue. We don't have the same community bank structure that you have, Bruce, but we do have credit unions. We do have alternate forms of finance. We have a long history of this in the West and in Eastern Canada. Whether we'll come out of this with those strengthened, more people moving their resources, I don't know, into that. But as you look into this sort of, let's say this fall, what do you anticipate we need to be planning for this fall as things, Mark, you just started to hint on it. What kinds of restaurants, how's that going to work? And then is there some major change that you think we need to be advocating for, that this has taught us we need to see to strengthen local economies? Who wants to go first? Bruce.
A couple things. I think we need to understand, in the US in particular, we are going to see a rise of big box retail. And so the triumph of cities is the small, the Jane Jacobs, the granular. But in many particularly low-income neighborhoods, folks are going out, they're shopping, and that's going to become the new normal. So the small local stores are getting crushed here and will probably disappear. And then we're going to have these corridors, almost suburban corridors within our cities, that will become the new shopping, you know, areas.
It's very depressing, Bruce.
Well, and this has been an ongoing issue in the U.S. because as our central business districts have come back, many low-income neighborhood commercial corridors have really struggled. I would say that we may see the rise of cooperative mechanisms, because if we're reliant on every small business, micro business in particular, but 0 to 20 employees to come back on their own, this is going to be a very long and painful recovery. If, however, we take whole corridors and begin to see master tenancies, new cooperative intermediaries, new financial products that really provide a platform for technology and for procurement and for entrepreneurial training, et cetera, legal, accounting, so forth, that might sort of prompt a quicker response. Last thing, Mark raised the war bonds, very interesting. The other experience in the US is the GI Bill, post-World War II. A lot of people are going to be in educational situations after this is over. Community colleges, workforce development programs, really 3 to 6 months or less in terms of reskilling and retraining, particularly on the technology side. That needs to be paid for in part by our national government. And that's just beginning to be thought through in the US.
Yeah. Mary, do you want to comment on this, sort of what you're seeing for the summer, and then any larger big moves that you think we should be advocating for?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things. I can't emphasize enough about this need for future skills, right? And this transition to digital. And, I think even in this respond, like not dissimilar to some of the other panelists, that we're seeing groups come together and figure out how they deliver online right today. And I think that that's really important, but it's going to impact all industries, right? These technologies are coming towards all industries, including our industrial ones, the ones we excel at like a tsunami. So the future skills has to be top of mind, I think, across the country. We kind of have a head start on it because we have a disproportionate number of highly educated, highly skilled talent that wants to stay in Calgary. And so we're running pilots on that right now, even through COVID. We have to continue to have this conversation about more support for local. And so, which leads into the next comment, which is that, for the last 5 years, I've exhausted every friendship I have talking about vacancies, and we really have to stop talking about vacancies and talk about vibrancy. And that really needs to be the focus. So it has to,
what did you say, from vacancy to vibrancy?
Yeah. And so that has kind of shifted us to think about all the things that Mark has done so well in Toronto. How do we do that? Because vibrancy was a problem before, when we were in the Calgary. And so, post-COVID, post the second potential structural change in this second global oil price war, we're going to have a bigger vibrancy problem than we've had the last 4 years, because we have enough office space to put another 140,000 people in downtown Calgary. But we've got to figure out how we pull people into the downtown, right? And so it's not just about live and conversion of office space to residential, and it's about play, it's about work, it's about learn, all the things Mark said. And I would just say connectedness, right? And so connectedness is, obviously, we all think about transit, but gosh darn it, in this digital world, we better be the best connected country. With respect, I don't want to be 5G ready, I want to be 10G ready.
Yeah. I mean, it couldn't be in sharper relief right now, eh? And Mary, in terms of Calgary, as you suggested, I mean, even before this, you had so many multiple hits there. So it's, there is a sinister side to resilience, which is, oh yeah, we're resilient, hit us again. I mean, there you are proving again and again and again you're resilient, but at the same time, you may be a little bit further ahead because you've been in this trench for a while, right? So the training piece, for instance, you've had to be on that already.
That's
right.
100% right. Not to mention, we had a similar situation, although it was a point in time. A lot of the practices were the same, and that was really post-flood of 2013. So, we were hit in 2013 with a flood, and then we were hit with a structural change in the energy industry in 2014. So it's been a long haul for Calgarians, and strangely, that there's a better sense of attraction now than there has ever been. Like, we're not seeing people leave like they did. The city, up until this 2020, like we've been growing, kind of like by 20,000 people a year during the downturn. Right? So there's a real strong sense of attachment to that. And so but you're 100% right. We're in the responding mode or recovery mode. And now we're just on, we're going back to survival, then rebuild, and then back to recovery, right? So it's I'm not looking for sympathy, by the way, everybody. I'm just
no. I mean, listen. I was in New Orleans after Katrina, so I know about this attraction factor, and we've seen it in Detroit as well. That at these times, you attract a certain kind of energy and commitment, and people starting. I mean, there is opportunity to start new conversations right now that haven't existed prior, right?
And at a political level, there's not a better time. You have to have political alignment, trust, and leadership at all levels. And if you don't have that, then it makes it really difficult.
I mean, the big question, which is coming up in the chat, I see John Staple has just raised it, is whether or not, as we recover here, are we going to make inequality worse, or are we going to actually be able to put in place the kinds of structural things that seem to be lacking that were allowing us to have these polarizations surfacing? It's a big question. I'm going to go to Mark and then Karen, and then we're going to wrap. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just want to add to the conversation about, you know, what is the future? What do we need to do next? I think through COVID is, and we touched on it briefly earlier in the conversation, is a lot of the business that were in place today were not stable prior to. If you look at the culinary business, restaurants, you know, 3.5 cents after their cost of doing business actually goes to savings. So they never had a large savings pool to begin with.
Right.
So based on they didn't have money, then going forward, the new change that has to come out of this new paradigm shift that has to occur is the cost of doing business has to be cheaper. We have to be healthier through economics for these small independent businesses, because I don't disagree with what Bruce has said is it could be all big box store anywhere going forward. And we've got to find a way to sustain the small independent. So the cost of doing business is just the staggering costs that they have to deal with has to be eliminated so that we can have savings and we can put money back into the economy.
So Mark, a question you and I batted around a bit is, are we ultimately going to have to look at different kinds of costing for street level businesses? In other words, that maybe street level businesses, different, Bruce implied this with master tenancies, different kinds of arrangements so that the rental cost is reduced significantly, the way they had to with Barcelona, I think. Is that something that's on your radar at all?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of the conversation. We have to look at the taxation within Toronto, specifically how MPAC functions best on highest and best use. And we also should be looking at implementation of programs around building owners and lessees having profit share. So their lease fees would go up as they become more successful, and that should be a phased-in approach going forward.
That's interesting.
Immediately post-COVID.
So there's new models of graded, yeah. And that we have to collectively as a community decide, though, that we believe in having these kinds of street level local businesses, that this is integral to who we are. Okay, Karen, last comment for you, and then we're going to do a little sum up.
Sure. So building a bit on what Mark just said, the future of retail, or hashtag the future of retail, is not something that was invented with COVID. We've seen the transformation of retail moving towards online e-commerce, or whatever you want to call it, right? It's been happening for a very long time. That being said, there are certainly certain sectors and industries that are being displaced, but by and large, though, what we are seeing is more supplementary. So it isn't necessarily a one-to-one zero-sum game, right? So we're talking about a scenario where, and to end on a positive note, it all depends on how long this lockdown or some version of this lockdown goes on. Because I spent 8 years in Asia, so I still talk to many of my friends in China and everywhere else, and they're open. I mean, they're reopening the businesses, right? But the way they've reopened is whatever tools and whatever industries and channels they've opened up are just now additional revenue streams for many of them, right? So it all depends on how agile we are, how quickly we can add those streams for the short term, and hopefully how quickly we can get through this whole shutdown period, because 3 months versus 12 months is going to be a huge difference, and that is where all of these programs that we're talking about come into play.
Just one last question as we head into the home stretch here. In the next 3 months, things are going to, as Karen suggested, things are probably going to start to reopen. Each of you, what would you see as the priority to reopen first? Quickly.
Sorry, I'll jump in. I'd say the priority is first to keep these good businesses through no fault of their own in existence. So they need cash to keep going. That's the first thing. And they need that cash over the next few months. And then we need to initiate programs that will stimulate purchase. So whether that's a buy local, those kinds of things. And then cities need to review how they tax some of these locations. I mean, when the average size restaurant in Halifax pays $40,000 in tax, and my residential tax is $6,000, I mean, there's just something wrong.
There's something wrong with that. So this notion of some cash procurement, and a buy local, and then some kind of recalibrating the taxation. Anybody else have another idea like that, something that could be looked at immediately? Mary, Bruce, Mark?
Look, I think we're going to need different financial products. Pre-COVID, we were looking at equity products for investment in small business, particularly minority-owned business. debt is going to be very difficult for folks to take on. So it's either going to be a cooperative model joined with different kind of financial instruments, joined with different kind of investors. That's what we've been pioneering with opportunity zones in the US, though it's an imperfect tool. But that started this conversation. We don't have the right small business ecosystem, particularly for the 0 to 20, which is really at the end, the raison d'etre of many of these urban districts and urban corridors.
Mary and Mark, anything to throw in behind that?
I agree with all of it, and I think the buy local, I mean, the government's lead by example with kind of local and social procurement, which we don't see a lot of across the country. Really agree with that. There's a couple of things. The financial tools I think are probably going to change, and I really like Mark's idea about the real estate community really needs to take a look at how they engage in kind of building owner and leasing profit sharing. I think that's a brilliant idea. It's probably long overdue, and particularly these times test us even more. But I would also say governments, with respect to kind of staging opportunities back or phasing them in, I think, we are seeing the common tool for governments during any kind of economic downturn is the investment in infrastructure, and we're seeing that. And so we've got to allow those projects to carry forward quickly, because it does really help put displaced workers back to work quickly.
Yeah, along with, and the retraining piece that you're having to dig so deep in. Mark and Karen, any last words from either of you?
Yeah, and I think I echo all the comments around financial, but I'm going to bring something forward that has nothing to do with math, money, and cash. We've got to seriously look, and we should be doing right now, about space. How the urban environment is going to have to play a key role in the success for this going forward. How do we convene again? How do we get families and children back into space? There is going to be a long-term effect of COVID-19 on everyone's mental capacity and abilities. And so we've got to start looking at space now, how we want to convene in space and bring that forward as an urgent, very urgent priority.
Yeah, I mean, we are about place and space. Karen, last word to you, and you can see my little friend here is visiting. It'll be about the children. I have a cat. Karen?
I would mainly add education regarding operational processes. I think that businesses need assistance and training on that, and they need to see best practices, because that's all we're doing. It's so rushed right now. Many businesses are not aware of what others are doing well or not doing well, and we have so many things we need to unlearn. Something as simple as handing somebody a receipt, having plexiglass in a store, whether or not you allow contactless tap on your pin pad, right?
Yeah.
So these are the types of things. They're very low hanging fruit, again, very simple, but we're going to have more and more cases come back the minute we open if we don't teach and educate merchants how to actually teach their staff to now operate. Otherwise, if people are not feeling safe, the consumers won't come back.
Yeah, I mean, there's just multi-layers. Well, listen, gang, you've been terrific to raise a whole bunch of questions and ideas for us and discussion points. As I suggested on the chat, we will repost specific ideas. And somebody asked what's happening around coordinating all this activity, and CUI is actually undertaking some specific work with business improvement areas and others who are interested in how are we going to actually stimulate and then support and sustain local businesses in their recovery, and particularly the place-based piece. We would encourage you, if you have examples of things that are happening, because stuff is happening that's interesting, post it on citysharecanada.ca. There's lots of ways that you can get this information out and get people discussing back and forth. We have two more of these City Talks this week. Wednesday, we're looking at community wealth, which is a perfect segue coming out of this session. How can actual wealth stay in local communities and particularly benefit community participation from folks that have been isolated and not engaged as much in these kinds of opportunities? What will that look like? Can we have a just and equitable distribution of that going forward? And then on Friday, we have a one-on-one conversation with me and Jay Pitter about called the Urbanist Wake Up Call and what's not happening in this conversation. So the chat stays open for 30 more minutes. The panelists, we all fade away, but the chat will stay open. So please have at it and weigh in, and we'll collect as much as we can, and we will post the results from this and this chat in a couple of days. Thank you, Mary, Patrick, Mark, Karen, Bruce. Thank you for being with us. We're happy to do City Talk with you, and we wish you all a good day.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.